Where was God? Where was God when a tyrant appealed to human fears, played on weaknesses, took advantage of our tendency to meet violence with violence, to stoke violence in the hearts and minds of citizens, of subjects, to make them instruments of violence and murder on behalf of the state? We have been faced with those questions many times. Dark clouds hang over human beings as we see these kinds of chapters written time and again. The Torah was not shy about telling us in detail that moment in history when the Pharaoh feigned not to know and recognize Joseph, to undermine a wonderful relationship between the Egyptian and the Jewish people. After that period in history when, as partners, they collaborated to meet the challenges of famine and drought and hunger and build a society of goodness. The Pharaoh appealed to his people's ancient proclivity for xenophobia and said they will become too numerous. They are our enemies, and so we must enslave them. And beyond appealing to people's willingness to volunteer for public works in a society that was trying to meet its needs, beyond creating a corvée through a program of governmental control, the Pharaoh enslaved the Jewish people and made them other, worried so that they would join their enemies, and convinced his people that not only slavery but murder, infanticide was right. He called upon the Hebrew midwives. Shifra and Pua, he said to the leaders of those midwives who would help the Hebrew Israelite women give birth, when a male child is born, it is now your obligation to kill that child. Where was God? Where is holiness? How does it come to answer tyranny? Already in the first chapter of the book of Exodus, we are given an incredible example, not just of midwives because they bring babies into the world, but because midwives are symbols of the potential to bring life into the world and allow it to flourish. In verse 17 of chapter 1, the Torah tells us, "Vatirena hamiyaladot et ha'Elohim, v'lo asu ka'asher diber alehen melech Mitzrayim." Shifra and Pua, the midwives, had a fear and an awe of God in their hearts. They knew with moral clarity that murder of infants, that the taking of life, that violence against Jewish families, that violence against fellow citizens is always wrong. And so the Torah, in the very first chapter, confronts the tyrant, the king of Egypt, the self-appointed king God, and has the resolve of women of faith standing up to tyrannical policy, to the murderous endeavors of the Pharaoh. Of their heroism, I'm sure Moses must have heard. And when the Torah says in chapter 2 that Moses grew up, not named yet as Moses, by the way, but the Torah says in verse 10 of chapter 2, "Vayigdal hayeled," and the child grew. And the child grew in the palace, and the child grew as part of society, and the child grew understanding the policies around him were those that he had to accept until the time that he must create a Keter Shem Tov, a name for himself, living up to his potential as a person, a man, and this applies to any man or woman, living up to his or her potential within the confines of a given society. And Moses then, Vayigdal Moshe, in his second use of the verb, and he grew, becomes Moses, the one aware of the suffering and the persecution going on all around him. While we usually read the verse, Vayetze el Echav, Vayar b'sivlotam, as he went out to his brothers, the Jewish people, and saw their suffering. Let's read more expansively. He went out into Egyptian society and saw that it was full of persecution, of tyranny. He saw the suffering not only of the Israelites, his brothers and sisters. He saw how society suffered. He even started to perceive how God must be suffering. Vayar ish mitzri makeh et. He saw the Egyptian man hit the ish ivri. The word ish is used twice. One man was hitting another man. The humanity was stolen from each of those souls, thrust into this drama of tyranny that Pharaoh had created. And so Moses reacts, Vayach et hamitri, and he reacts with violence. He takes it upon himself to use the tools that were at his disposal because he was part of that milieu. But soon, thankfully, he would release himself from that cycle of violence that was begun in the first two chapters of the book of Exodus. And then we see Moses set into motion, out guiding sheep, learning the ways of leadership. And just like that verb he saw when he recognized the persecution and the suffering and the fact that people were caught in the cycles of violence, he saw, Vayar, V'hinei asnei bo'er ba'esh, and the bush was on fire, and it was not consumed. Where was God? God was in the hearts of Shifra and Puah, the midwives, and God was now in Moses' heart, in his soul. The spark in his heart was fanned into flames. There's where God was, in the moral clarity and knowledge that murder of infants and fellow citizens is always wrong, like with Shifra and Puah. And there was God in Moses' perceiving that his journey as a leader had only begun, that he would have to respond to state violence and work to stop it. The message of Exodus and Moses' leadership is thus self-awareness and tapping into holiness, means fanning the flames of divinity that lead us to stand up against any and all violence at the hands of citizens, and surely in the name of the empire or state. God is a shared language of virtue. God is a burning in our hearts and souls of creating a righteous society that finds in one another the divine image and nurtures the spirit of life itself. May we, as we begin the reading of the book of Exodus, feel so inspired. May we find the goodness and godliness in our hearts and souls to be instruments of light and life and work against any and all violence, to answer tyrants who would appeal to human fear, play on weakness, and take advantage of our most base tendencies. We will be embraced by that sense that God redeems us if we become the leaders within the great dramas and narratives of history. Today, in our world, as we reflect on our ancestors' successes, may we be blessed with their strength. Ken Yihirat. May that be God's will. Shabbat Shalom.